well, it's nice to be in front of probably many of the same people again. And I mean, this topic connects quite closely with the panel discussion we've just had. So I'll apologise if there's any repetition, but it's a real pleasure to talk about the modernisation case for the New Zealand Parliament. And I'd start by saying there's no single strategy about this. There's a variety of strands of work that are going on around modernisation. And I think in our Parliament here, there is a cultural and an institutional norm that things can always be improved. And I don't claim that to be unique to this Parliament or to this country, but it is an important part of the thinking. It's quite deeply ingrained in people. And it's emphasised by our 3-yearly review of the procedures of Parliament. So there's a review of our standing orders every 3 years, not necessarily in response to any particular crisis or problem, but it's just a regular cycle of review. And not all modernisation is procedural or procedurally driven, but it is important to think about it as well. The Parliament needs to stay relevant to have democratic legitimacy, in my view. And some of the recent changes that have been made in New Zealand are to improve scrutiny of the executive, to modernise the sort of language that's used in the House around some of the procedural motions, to make it more accessible and understandable to the public and easier for new MPs. Making rules around webcasting committees, which developed organically and with relatively little thought, but just in response to demand, and ways of responding to decisions from our higher courts that might impact on the Parliament as well. So these are some of the recent changes that are very much procedurally based, but many of them also play out with a technical component or need implementing in some way. And equally, there are lots of opportunities to modernise in a technical sense or an administrative way, sometimes behind the scenes. And as I said in the last session, there are more ideas about those than there are ever time or resources to implement them. But I do think that constant cycle of upgrading and improving and thinking about the change can make it a little bit hard to step back from that daily work and take a longer distance look into the future. And I think that's really important. And I advocate that people do that. We've been doing some recently, looking ahead by about 3 parliaments, so which is 9 years, but we made it a 10-year window to think about how things might change and how we could prepare for them and what we should do. And I suppose there are several different approaches to preparing cases for modernisation. They're driven different ways. Procedural changes are led by MPs with advice from staff, for example. Strategies for public engagement, for our engagement and relationships, our sort of parliamentary diplomacy with other parliaments, are staff-led, but with feedback from MPs and endorsement by them as well. And some modernisation is really entirely staff-led, but needs procedural endorsement. And I think I mentioned the last session the example of e-petitions, which needed some rule changes so that they could work in the Parliament, and written questions which needed to be recognised in the standing orders in order to be legitimate, to be an electronic system as well. And then there are strategies for modernising services and making better use of technology that are really staff-led and largely invisible to MPs. So a lot of our tools for public engagement, not the result, the engagement itself always involves MPs. That's who we want the public to engage with, not us. Systems to support the House and committee. So a lot of those things are invisible. So there's, I guess, a lot of different strands, and the drive to modernise comes from a range of sources as well. So from elected members, sometimes through things they see elsewhere, they might see in other parliaments, or they might bring knowledge of something into Parliament from their previous careers, or things that annoy them or bother them or they don't think are as good as they could be. So they're certainly one of the portals for new ideas. Staff, obviously, who go to conferences like this, who have connections with colleagues overseas, and who know how things work behind the scenes as well. I'd also add the public, who do propose changes, both to the rules of Parliament, but also about the way it does things. And sometimes we actively seek that out. We ask them to comment on our standing orders review. We've asked people recently for their views on their experiences of presenting to parliamentary committees. And the public are very willing to tell us, and that's great. And circumstances as well that are external to the Parliament, COVID, being the obvious recent one that led to virtual committees in a hybrid house, but also weather events. We've had some cyclones and floods in New Zealand that have meant that MPs couldn't all gather in Wellington, in the capital, for plenary sessions. So increasingly, those climate challenges might be something we need to respond to as well, and we need to think about them now, not when the Parliament buildings are underwater one day or something. So I mentioned we've done some strategic thinking recently, looking forward, I suppose, into the medium term. And I think it's fair to say most of that medium and long-term thinking comes from staff and the administration, because we have permanent jobs. It's difficult for MPs who are, in our case, in a 3-year electoral cycle, which is very short by international standards. But it is very difficult for them to think about the long term when every 3 years they've got to go out and try and get their jobs back. And that's what they're doing at the moment. We've got an election in about a month's time. So a lot of that thinking does come from within the organisation. And there are a number of ideas that we've come up with, that we're in the early stages of working on at the moment. A paper-free Parliament, for example. So with the hybrid sittings of the House, electronic availability of documents for members and staff, possibly digital voting, digital dashboards so that MPs can see where things are up to, what's coming next, and paper-free select committees in particular, which are hugely intensive on paper. I mentioned in the last session that I learned an important lesson about 15 years ago when I made some assumptions that all members would welcome going paper-free, and found out that they didn't, and had to step back from that a bit. So certainly it's important when making those changes to work in with your customers, who in this case are elected members and also the public. There's the possibility of using AI, as we've mentioned, for a variety of areas that could free up staff time, enable people to use their expertise in areas where it's really needed, and take a lot of that repetitive work that's often done in late at night or in unsociable hours in parliaments, which tend to meet in afternoons and evenings. Could change that in ways that would be excellent. Artificial intelligence has huge possibilities in terms of managing the huge numbers of submissions we're receiving to parliamentary committees, and perhaps doing some initial analysis of them for our staff. There are also technological possibilities for enhancing independent analysis and advice to parliamentarians. In New Zealand, probably because of our small size and limited budget, a lot of that advice that MPs receive comes from public servants who have often worked on legislative proposals and work for a government minister. And so although they do their best to be impartial, it's very clear where their loyalties lie, and there's quite a strong push from civil society for more independent advice to Parliament. We can't afford that at the moment. And so, there are possibilities that AI it wouldn't provide the advice, but it could do a lot of the initial legwork with analysis, which, would be fantastic. Again, technology will almost certainly provide the solutions for us to be able to broadcast and webcast more of our content. We, during COVID, broadcast some of our parliamentary committees on our parliamentary TV channel, and it might surprise you to know that a lot of people watched it. Partly that was because they were at home and there probably wasn't a lot else to do, but we did have a huge uptake of that and a great deal of interest and a rise in sort of engagement with that side of Parliament. So there are, great possibilities there. And the other project that's underway at the moment that I'll mention is media asset management. So at the moment, we use commercially available, not commercially available, free social media channels for communicating with the public. But there are a variety of different ones. They're not particularly well integrated into our own systems. We'd like to do some work so that they are better integrated, that they all work the same way. But also we have control over the end product once it goes out to the public in a way that we don't, for example, by streaming on Facebook Live. So there are a lot of thoughts. The other one I mentioned in the last session was around the possibility of using AI for interpretation into other languages. New Zealand Sign Language and the Indigenous Māori language, for example, are both used in the Parliament. And there's a real shortage of sign language interpreters. So whether there are technical solutions there beyond just captioning would be great to explore. But really, most of these initiatives are stymied by a lack of resource. And I do go on about this a bit, but the Parliament is quite badly under-resourced for reasons that I talked about in the previous session. But I think primarily because the Parliament doesn't help the government deliver on its programs and policies. In fact, it criticises them and scrutinises them in ways that governments might not find particularly attractive to fund, to be even more critical. And that really does hold back the possibilities. There's a lot of potential, there's a lot of ideas. There's not the resources for them. And so one of the ways we're looking to technology is, if there is no increase in availability of taxpayer funding for the Parliament, ways that technology can help us focus our human efforts in areas, for things that only people can do, and where technology could do a lot of the heavy lifting on the more repetitive and the more repetitive work that needs perhaps less human discretion. So that's really where we're at the moment. As I say, there's a lot of ideas. We can't implement them all at any one time, partly because we can't afford to, partly because the staff is quite small and very keen to have ideas, but at a greater rate than we have the availability of people to implement them. So I might just stop there. That's an overview of what we're doing at the moment. And I suppose I just want to leave you with the impression that it happens across a variety of strands. There isn't a single thing called the New Zealand Parliament Modernisation Strategy, but it is deeply connected with our procedural work and also our technical work, bound together to try and deliver a good result.